All right. Well, I will go ahead and at least get our introduction started here. I know we'll, we might have some people trickling in, and that's okay. But I'll at least start introducing our topic and our awesome speaker who's joining us this evening. But thank you all for joining us. And for those of you who might be watching this recording later on, thank you also for joining us after the fact. This is a really still a timely topic, something that's been on our radar, for the past decade or so, but really rising to prominence in the last, 5 or 6 years is this discussion about, um, flavored tobacco, e-cigarettes, and vaping specifically, and youth, and what we can do, and what are our responses to these. And so, thank you for joining us. Here we go. I'm going to get my slides to work with me too. I'm Chelsea Walzak-Ferks. I'm Senior Director of Community Impact for the American Heart Association locally. And joining me tonight is Alex Swift. She is a Youth Development Assistant at San Diego County Office of Education. She works with the county's Tobacco Use Prevention Education Program and does vaping prevention presentations and trainings to students, parents, and school staff all over the county. And, I have to thank her so much for giving her time this evening and joining us. And one more shout out, I did want to thank Kim Hummer Avagadori from California Youth Advocacy Network for borrowing me a few slides that we'll be using tonight. And also a special thank you to the Dr. Seuss Foundation, who is supporting some of our work in these efforts. Without further ado, I did want to call out one thing. Our Q&A is open. If you've got questions to submit to us throughout the presentation, please feel free to do so. We will get to them towards the end, but we will make sure to answer all those questions or, want to make sure to open up towards a dialogue at the end as well. All right, so our session overview, we're going to be talking through some of the recent data, some of our national and California data, and talking about some of the considerations, what to look for and what to do when you're thinking about youth and smoking or vaping, what's next, and a little bit on Prop 31, and then some resources. All right, so let's dive in and take look at some of our current numbers. As you'll notice this evening, and I do want to make this distinction, we tend to use the word tobacco to encompass all sorts of products that have nicotine in them. We often call traditional or combustible tobacco products things that you'll think about like cigarettes, cigarillos, little cigars, smokeless or chewing tobacco, hookah, regular cigars, while e-cigarettes, or more the term is started vaping, has what's been growing in popularity with youth kind of over the last 7 to 8 years. Just wanted to make that quick distinction. So you're going to see a little bit of the divide in those terminologies. So I wanted to cover the National Youth Tobacco Survey, the most recent data. As you can see, current cigarette and e-cigarette use amongst high school students, and current use is defined as our past 30-day use. In green here, you can see cigarette use going down amongst high school students over the past decade, which is really promising. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that trend upward in our blue and e-cigarette use. In the past few years, so we saw a really large peak and jump in about 2019. I wouldn't want to note that in 2017, that's when Juul really was introduced and gained a lot of popularity. So you start to see increases there in some of the more prominent players around vape devices. In 2018, the Surgeon General actually issued an advisory statement recognizing youth vaping as an epidemic. And you see that it even rose even more that year after in 2019. Now in 2022, our most recent data is showing about 14% of high school students are currently using e-cigarette or vaping devices. That is a lower number, and we're glad to see that trajectory going down. That still is a large percentage of students who, without the introduction of these vaping devices, wouldn't be using tobacco products. As you can see here, more than 3 million students are currently using a tobacco product. About 1 million youth are using multiple tobacco products, though e-cigarettes are the most commonly used, and about 1 million students use any combustible tobacco products. So again, thinking about those cigarettes, cigars, cigarillos, and young people who've ever used an e-cigarette are more likely to smoke cigarettes compared to youth who don't vape. So you're going to see some of that crossover here with youth who use multiple tobacco products. And in fact, the Truth Initiative, there was a study in 2020 that youth who vape are have 7 times higher odds of smoking cigarettes a year after initial survey. So there's a lot of seen tendencies for crossover use after using trendy and often seen as less harmful vape products. Now, more than 1 in 4 of those current users are using it daily, most commonly using disposables device types, so not as much of those tanks and mods, which Alex is going to talk about a little bit later. And almost 85% of students are citing that they're using flavored products. Now, I'm going to go a little bit into our California data. This is the California Student Tobacco Survey data. It lines up pretty well. Actually, California's got a little bit lower of the product use rate here. I know this is a little bit tougher to see, but getting right around 10% and actually about 8% for electronic smoking devices in 2020. So the data doesn't quite match up. It's not quite the same place where that what 2022 data was from the National Youth Survey. But we're seeing, if a little bit lower rates, still similar rates, right around 10% of high school students in the state using tobacco products. Now, this slide is a little bit different, shows actually pretty similar rates, but this is for young adults. So thinking 18 to 25-year-olds, you're thinking beyond high school students. This is really important, as you can see that this actually continues on beyond high school. It's not just a fad, right? This is definitely a nicotine addiction. This is something that carries over into young adult use and eventually adult use. Here. So, all right, there we go. Sorry about that. Slides were not quite working with me. One thing I want to touch on in consideration with these datas and with the new, kind of the trends of things, where they're going and where we're seeing things, is that we're just hopefully coming out of a large pandemic, right? One thing with the data collection is that in the past few years, things have changed a little bit. So the certainty and the accuracy of some of the data has been questioned. Though we do know that some of the decrease, could be in the fact that surveys weren't getting to as many students and in different ways than they're used to in the past, but also potentially seeing decreases in use with a little bit less access, being out of school, decreased peer interactions, and also increase, time with parents that you're spending at home. I mean, on the flip side as well, thinking about the pandemic, is that some user rates may have increased due to stress, more isolation and boredom, and then also just increased use based on the fact that there is an increased acceleration of that addiction and that need for nicotine. All right. And then, the other consideration here really is mental health. So before the pandemic, we had seen youth and young adult mental health worsening, feelings of sadness and hopelessness increasing, to almost 1 in 3 high school students, and increases in suicidal behaviors. And even since the pandemic, this has really been exacerbated. Huge disruption of normal life, definitely disproportionately impacting marginalized youth. And approximately 50% of young adults reported mental health symptoms during the pandemic. During the 2020 to 2021 school year, more than 60% of college students actually met the criteria for at least one mental health problem. And as you can see, 1 in 5 college students are actually reporting worsening mental health since the pandemic. So, another consideration when we're thinking about the use rates and, decision making around potential tobacco use. All right, so now I am going to let our amazing speaker, Alex, jump in and talk to us about vices and kind of what to think about and about addiction in general. Thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Chelsea. And thanks so much for inviting me here to speak on this. I'm in schools a lot, and I have the opportunity to talk to young people about this a lot. So I'm happy to be able to share this information with other members of the community, parents, whoever wants to hear it, needs to hear it. So I'm so happy to be here to be able to share what I know. So we're first going to take a look at sort of the devices in general. And so you can go ahead and go to that next slide, Chelsea. So these devices, you can see kind of a range, and they come in all different shapes and sizes. And one of the things that's important to know here is that these devices have only been around since about 2007. That's when they first came out here in the United States. And they were mostly the first generation, so those Cigalikes there on the left. So these devices have only been around for the last 15 years in this modern vaping device, and really only popular in the last 5 years or so. So as they started to get more popular and they started to evolve and change, the devices got away from that look of traditional cigarettes into some of the other examples that you can see here, the mods and the tanks, the pod systems down there at the bottom. And all of these devices, they all have a battery, they all have an atomizer inside, which is the part that does the heating, and they all have somewhere for the e-liquid to go. So those are the basic components that make these electronic smoking devices or e-cigarettes or vaping devices, whatever term you want to use. Those are the base components, but as you can see, they come in all different shapes and sizes. And the ones that are really popular right now, and if you want to go to that next slide, these devices are the ones that are popular right now and that we are seeing in schools. We're seeing young people using. We're seeing young adults and adults using these as well, but especially popular with young people. You can see they're bright and colorful. They, some of them don't look anything like a cigarette. They wouldn't remind you of a cigarette. They don't look like something that adults would necessarily associate with tobacco products. But really important here is that all of these devices that you see on the screen, all of these examples, they all contain nicotine. And when we're looking at this vaping epidemic with young people, it's really the nicotine that is the driving factor. That's one of the most important things that we need to talk about, especially with how much nicotine are in these things, right? So in the middle of the screen, there's that puff bar that's pink. It's a guava ice flavor. That size puff bar contains the same amount of nicotine as 50 cigarettes, or 2.5 packs of cigarettes worth of nicotine in that one device. Devices that are larger and have more e-liquid in them will oftentimes contain more nicotine. And so when we're looking at the initiation into these devices, they don't look like cigarettes, and they don't taste like cigarettes, and they don't smell like cigarettes. So it's really easy to think that they're not going to be harmful like a cigarette. And many young people go into use thinking that, not realizing how much nicotine they're getting. And when we look at what happened, especially with Juul, at the height of its popularity, Juul first came out in 2015, but between 2016 and 2018, about 2/3 of the young people that were using Juul devices did not know that they contain nicotine. So that's a really big problem when we know what happens to the brain when someone uses nicotine, which we can start talking about now also. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. One of the things that I talk about with young people when I'm in front of them and we're talking about vaping is I try to find out why young people think someone might start vaping in the first place. And a lot of times I get the answers that we would normally assume are reasons, things like peer pressure, their friends are using them, they want to experiment, or they think it's less harmful. But one of the ones that's starting to stand out more and more when I'm going into middle schools and high schools talking to young people about this is how quickly stress and anxiety come up in these conversations. When I ask them why they think someone might start, a lot of times the answers that I hear, second or third in this conversation is to deal with something at home, or to deal with stress, or to deal with anxiety, or to deal with depression. And I think that, that hasn't happened by accident, that people are turning to substances in general, but especially nicotine as a means to cope with that mental health. And I really appreciate that Chelsea brought that up a few slides ago, because I think it is so important that when we're talking about not just youth use of tobacco in general, we're not just talking about nicotine addiction, we're talking about this whole other really important topic, and that is the mental health piece, and the fact that this is the reason why some young people are starting to vape and starting to initiate into that. With advertisements, it doesn't come up as much, but it's important to know that the tobacco industry spends $25 million each day on their marketing. That's over $9 billion a year. And if we want to put that into perspective a little bit of just how much money that is. In 2019, McDonald's for the entire year spent $447 million on marketing. That's the same amount of money the tobacco industry spends in 18 days. So it's a lot of money that's going into their ads, in stores, on social media, and product placement on streaming shows and things like that. And young people are more sensitive to tobacco ads than adults. Part of that has to do with brain development. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And while I'm asking students about these reasons, and I get most of those are on the previous slide were the most common ones, addiction is not usually an answer for why someone might start. Nobody usually brings up that someone starts vaping because they want to be addicted to nicotine, or they want to have this dependence. But that is oftentimes one of the results, and it's because of the way our brains develop. And our brains continue to develop until we're in our mid-20s, around the age of 25. And during the teenage years especially, there's some really important development that is happening. And it's the development that takes us into adulthood. So obviously we're not born knowing how to survive and thrive as an adult. That has to come as our brain is developing. And so some of the really important things that are happening during the teenage years are our brains are learning how to deal with difficult emotions. And this is where that conversation about mental health can be so important, because as teenagers, one of the jobs of our brains is to learn how to deal with our frustrations, our anger, our anxiety, our stress, which are very normal parts of being an adult, as I'm sure all of you know. When we have to pay bills and put food on the table, you have to make dinner or plan dinner every night. Like, that's when you become an adult, you're on your own. You have to do that every day, and then clean up from it, and then wake up and do it again the next day. So it's not easy. There's a lot of stress involved with being an adult. And so as we're teenagers, our brain is constantly learning ways to deal with those emotions. And so when we turn to substances like alcohol or nicotine or marijuana or any other substance, when we turn to those as the solution to deal with those difficult emotions, it makes it so our brain doesn't get the chance to learn those things. It makes it so that our brain learns that the best way to deal with stress, the best way to deal with anger or anxiety is to vape or is to drink, is to smoke, whatever the substance may be. We then become adults with brains that don't know how to deal with those difficult emotions and then have to rely on those substances in order to deal with the stress of paying our bills, or the car breaks down, or we lose our job, those things that happen, and we have to get through them. But our brains learn that the way to deal with those things is to vape or drink or smoke. And then figuring out some other things like what we like, what we don't like, what's going to help us survive and thrive into adulthood. One of the ways that our brains do this is by creating a hierarchy of survival. So that hierarchy of survival is the way that we learn how to survive and thrive as an adult. So the things that we need to do in order to survive, eating, sleeping, staying hydrated, exercising, those things, when we do them, they release a chemical in our brain. That chemical is dopamine, and dopamine makes us feel good. Dopamine's also released when we do things not necessarily for our survival, but so that we can thrive as an adult. So things like building relationships. So as teenagers, when we're hanging out with our friends, when we're thinking about our friends, when we're messaging our friends, those things release dopamine. The reason for this, we can trace back in our evolution as humans. When our ancestors were hunters and gatherers, those ancestors would be more likely to survive if they were with other people, with other humans that could help them if they came up against an animal much larger than themselves, or if they got hurt or sick and couldn't get food for themselves. So building relationships and having people around you is part of our evolution. It releases dopamine. Same thing with learning new skills. Again, those ancestors who were hunters and gatherers, they'd be more likely to survive if they were learning new ways to fish, learning new ways to trap food, learning new ways to find food. So it's ingrained in us as humans to seek out those new experiences. And the prime for this is during the teenage years, because that is the time that we are learning how to survive and thrive as an adult. So what nicotine does is when it enters our brain, it creates an artificial release of dopamine, right? So nicotine's not one of the things we need in order to survive. We need to eat, we need to sleep, we need to stay hydrated, we need to exercise, we need to build relationships with people, we need to learn and practice skills. Those things will get us into a healthy adulthood. Nicotine is not one of those things. It's not something that we need, but it tricks the brain into thinking that it is. It causes this flood of dopamine to be released, and dopamine makes us feel good. But the amount of dopamine that's released when nicotine enters the brain for the first time is so much dopamine, it feels really good. And so our brain quickly learns, once nicotine is introduced, that this is something that's important and we need to do in order to survive. And the way that our brain decides what is most important is the level of dopamine. So the more dopamine, the more important. And so that's what nicotine is doing. It's tricking our brain into thinking it's something important we need in order to survive. And a really important thing to know here is that this whole process of dopamine being released in our brain is not something that we can control. So becoming dependent on nicotine, it doesn't mean that someone's weak. It doesn't mean that they're a failure. It doesn't mean that they don't have good morals. It is a chemical reaction happening in the brain. And the younger someone is, the more development their brain has to go into, the farther away they are from that 25, that mid-20s, the faster and more severely this happens. If you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, we have just kind of putting that into another perspective, this cycle of addiction. When someone vapes or smokes for the first time, the nicotine goes, it's absorbed through their lungs. It takes 5 to 7 seconds to get to the brain. In the brain, it releases that flood of dopamine and it feels good. Some people describe it as a high or a buzz because it's so much dopamine and it feels really good. But then what happens is the brain starts to crave more dopamine. So the brain craves that huge flood of dopamine that nicotine will release. And so the brain will start to send signals. And the brain sending these signals is basically saying, hey, why aren't you doing this thing that we now know is important for our survival? And remember, nicotine is not something that is important that we need in order to survive. But our brain is tricked into thinking that. So our brain will start to send these signals to other parts of the body to say, hey, do this thing that we think is important for our survival. And those signals can be things like headaches, it can be nausea, it can be mood swings, it can be anxiety attacks or panic attacks. And so all of these things, it's going to be different depending on the person, but those signals that the brain is sending are what we know of as withdrawal symptoms. And because it's so much dopamine that is released by nicotine, the withdrawal symptoms are very strong, or they can be very strong, very severe. And the only way to ease them, to make them better, to make the headache go away, to make the nausea go away, to stop the panic attack or whatever the symptom is to use more nicotine. And so then the person vapes or smokes, gets more nicotine, it feels good, the withdrawal symptoms go away, the brain stops sending those signals. But then as the nicotine wears off, the brain sends more signals, and we have this cycle. And nicotine is one of the most difficult substances to quit because of this cycle, this process, and what's happening in the brain. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And so nicotine is one of the main things that we focus on, that we talk about, because it is the thing that gets people addicted. It's the thing that hooks people to smoking or vaping. But it's not just the nicotine that can be harmful. And when we're talking about vaping, what's being inhaled has been kind of incorrectly categorized as safer than cigarette smoke, although something being safer doesn't necessarily make it safe. But when we're looking at what is being inhaled when someone vapes, it's an aerosol. What I mean by that is that it's tiny particles suspended in gas that leaves behind a residue. And when we think about aerosols that we use around the house, things like hairspray or cooking spray or body spray or spray sunscreen, the reason we like those things is because they're an aerosol, because they leave behind a residue. Cooking spray is really useful to spray in a pan. A residue is left behind and it keeps your food from sticking. So we like aerosols for a lot of these things. But when someone's vaping and they inhale that aerosol into their lungs, that's where the residue is getting left behind. Cigarette smoke is also an aerosol, tiny particles suspended in gas that leave behind a residue. It's not just cigarette smoke, though. Any smoke, marijuana smoke, cigar smoke, smoke from a campfire bonfire, all of those are also aerosols. And our lungs are not meant to inhale aerosols. Our lungs aren't meant to inhale anything but air. So when you're inhaling an aerosol, it doesn't really matter whether or not that aerosol has nicotine, or whether or not it's flavored, or whether or not it comes from burning something or heating something or spraying something. All of those aerosols can damage the lungs and damage the body. And especially with something like a vape that contains nicotine, whether or not it's flavored, the person is inhaling an aerosol, residue is getting left behind in the lungs. Some of the nicotine is going up to the brain, but that's not the only place that nicotine goes. Nicotine is a substance that's known to cause cancer. And because nicotine is a stimulant, it can also cause harm to the heart. So one of the things that nicotine will do is it causes an increased heart rate. And in the body, nicotine can activate our fight or flight response. So that instinct that when our life is in danger, we're about to die, we're either going to stay and fight or run and hide, depending on what's going to be more likely to keep us alive. That's a really good instinct to have when we're about to die. But with nicotine starting that, kind of kicking in our fight or flight response when we're just going through our day, going through normal things, sitting in class, sitting in a meeting, watching a movie, whatever it may be, it puts a lot of strain on the heart to be in that fight or flight mode, to be in that, increased activity under that kind of stress in those normal everyday activities. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. And again, if there's any questions about anything that we're talking about, you can go ahead and put it in that Q&A there. One of the other things, it's great to have all of this information, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to be here to learn a little bit more about this. Some of the other stuff that's important to take away is how to talk to young people about it, and to kind of how to sense if a young person is using. So up on your screen, you can see some of the ways to identify tobacco use. Now, this isn't the be all end all, this isn't everything, and it's not necessarily any of these things are for sure a sign of vaping, but it is some things that could be a sign. So just some things to look out for, some of the physical symptoms, and then the environment changes as well. Because things like nausea or vomiting could be a sign of nicotine withdrawals, or too much nicotine. So like if someone's vaping a lot and they get too much nicotine in their body, it could be that, or it could be something else. So just kind of taking a look at everything and having conversations. Which brings us to the next slide. I believe Chelsea is going to be sending all these out. So if you didn't get all of those bullet points, you will be able to get them. But talking to young people, this comes from a really great resource, and it kind of walks through the steps of how to talk to young people in a way that hopefully no one's going to shut down. And starting with before the conversation, with knowing the facts. And so getting the information either from the Truth Initiative, or Stanford has great information on vaping prevention, the American Lung Association, or Kick It California, which is a free statewide cessation service for tobacco cessation, so quitting any tobacco, including vaping products. They have a lot of really great one-page documents on how to talk to your kids and how to quit, how to support someone quitting. They have one that's on mood and tobacco, and how those how mood can be affected by tobacco use. But getting the information and thinking about why young people start in the first place, like we've talked about. For some, it is that peer pressure because their friends are doing it, but it could also be any of these other reasons, or multiple reasons, including because they think it's going to help them deal with mental health issues. And preparing yourself to be able to listen in an open, non-judgmental way, and then starting the conversation, answering their questions with honest and science-based information. That's why it's so important to know the facts ahead of time. And then keeping the conversation going. You want to make sure that it's not just a one and done. You don't have the, hey, you don't vape, right? Nope, I don't vape, Dad. Okay, cool, good talk, and then that's the end of it. You got to keep it going. And being a good listener and staying calm. I know that sometimes that can be easier said than done, but this is just to help with that, information. And then finally, if you want to go to the last slide for me, are just some resources. So as you're thinking about places to get that information, if you want to start the conversation either with your own kids, or maybe with young people that you work with or just interact with, these are some places, some resources that Chelsea has put together. And again, the slides are going out, so you don't have to worry about not getting all the information. But the Surgeon General has really great information, tobacco-free California, American Heart Association, of course. preventment and treatment resources from the California Youth Advocacy Network. They have a lot of downloads that you can use, including things you can use on social media. Truth Initiative is great. Kick It California, again, are those cessation resources. With a lot of info sheets. Most of their info sheets have been translated into Spanish as well, if you need Spanish resources. And then, especially if you're working with young people and students in the county, you can always go to the San Diego County Office of Education website. We have resources and more information on our prevention services there. With that, I'm going to pass it back over to Chelsea.
Thank you so much, Alex. I wanted to make sure we did a plug for San Diego County Office of Education because they've got some great resources, especially for students within the county, things that are really local and specific. So thank you again for covering all of that. It's hard to follow that up. You're such a great presenter, and you really make some incredible points, and especially thinking about the addiction quality, of nicotine and how that has a larger effect. So now I get to put our conversation a little bit to talk about Prop 31 and California's flavored tobacco sales restriction. So I do want to give a little bit of a background here. So those of you who maybe catching up with this or may want a little bit of a refresher. So California originally restricted the sale of most flavored tobacco products in the fall of 2020. It seems like so long ago, but just about a little over 2 years ago, with the signing of California's State Senate Bill 793, excuse me. There was immediately industry pushback and a referendum to put this as a ballot initiative. And in November of 2022, so just this past month, voters upheld the law. You can see about 2/3 of voters upheld this law, and it will actually go into effect on December 21st, so just around the corner. We're all really excited to see that. Delaying the implementation, so this industry pushback, this tactic, delaying that implementation cost Californians about $800 million in tobacco-related healthcare costs. So, one thing to think about, though, even though overwhelmingly the state of California, stood up and said, yes, we want this law intact and we want it to go into effect. There's already so many healthcare costs that racked up in those 2 years. In addition, the other thing to think about is all those new users who started using in this time period. So we know that flavors and heavy marketing were a big draw and a big thing that attracted new users, especially youth using flavored tobacco products, especially the e-liquids or flavored vapes was a massive draw. So thinking about all of the new potentially lifelong addicted users that they've drawn in those 2 years is just very devastating. One notable thing is actually this week, it was announced that the RJ Reynolds lawsuit that was tried to be used to stop the law going into effect was actually denied by the Supreme Court. And so the passage of Prop 31 does in fact affirm that SB 793, this flavored tobacco sales restriction, will take effect on December 21st. All right, so what does that mean for us? What are our next steps? We're really excited to see this go into effect because we know that has a lot of impact. In fact, policies that prohibit the sale of flavored tobacco products, we've seen this in certain jurisdictions. We've seen this at least in one other state. Removing the products from these communities and reducing youth access to the products really helps lower youth use rates. And it also eliminates advertising and marketing in community spaces because those products aren't allowed to be available. You can see, I love the impact of the picture at the bottom of the screen. might not be that this kid has someone in their life around them that might be using or anything like that might be using tobacco, but they're seeing it in places that they are, right, in a convenience store, something that's might be something that they can see, and they're curious about it and they're wondering about it, right? You never know how big of an impact that has. So in terms of what's next, I think what we're going to really see is the need to support cessation. Um, have the services and supports able and ready, being willing and able to have these conversations more and more with youth that Alex just talked about so eloquently, right? Trying to uncover if a young person in your life might be having the struggle, if their favorite flavored product is going to be going off the shelves locally and they might not have access to it, there are some bigger consequences that are going to come from this, right? Somebody actually asked, someone sent in a question ahead of time, is there a concern that, excuse me, I have it written down here, so I just popped right up. Um, do you think teens will be less likely to smoke with this or more likely to switch to a different nicotine delivery method like cigarettes? And, that is it's a real possibility that you might see some people who might switch. They might, as Alex pointed out, nicotine is incredibly addictive and it does things for your brain that at such a level that really have a hold on people. So sorry, the point that I'm trying to make here is that thinking about cessation, having these conversations with people and trying to lead them down the difficult path of quitting is going to be really important. So having this from community-based organizations, which I know a few of you are joining us from, having this in schools, having the resources for parents, really everywhere that a young person might need the support, making sure that it is there and available. Another thing that we're going to really have to think about is how we respond to new products that are coming on the market. There are always going to be ways that the tobacco industry is going to try to exploit loopholes. We've seen it time and time again, and this is no exception, right? There are a few exceptions in the state law that it doesn't cover shisha, premium cigars, and loose leaf tobacco. And like I said, the industry often finds if there is a will, there's a way, and will try to find their way in. And so keeping our eye on new products is going to be really important. And finally, strong local enforcement is going to make the implementation of the state bill what's successful. The real teeth in the enforcement does come at the local level. So many organizations, including the American Heart Association, are going to be still pushing for local policies like tobacco retail licensing. We'll still be working with communities and local jurisdictions to have even stronger and more complete flavored tobacco sales restrictions, complete bans. And if you want to join us in that bite, we would love to have you. I've got a quick pitch for our You're the Cure network. It's our advocacy network. And there's a couple ways to join here. If you want to, help us and make sure that your voice is heard in your city or even in the county, you want to make sure, tobacco retail license is happening by you, please feel free to join us. Right. And then, I talked about cessation in our last slide, but I really want to make sure I put this up here. So there are quite a few different cessation support services. We talked about Kegit, California. They've got great support in multiple languages, which is great to call out. There are some more youth oriented, texting app based, cessation support services, just a few here. But I think the important thing is that there are so many out there. And I want to speak on behalf of public health officials and people who are working in this and just saying, I don't care which one you use. as long as you're using one and you're working on quitting. I think that's the most important thing. And that's probably the most important thing that we can, reach people and especially young people with. All right. So that brings us to the end of our slides and our session, but I do want to open this up for any questions. I know we've got at least one more that came in, and I'm going to check our Q&A to see. I don't know that we had any more, but Alex, I am going to pull up one that someone sent in beforehand, and I'm going to hopefully toss this one up to you. And I saw another one coming too, but Alex, the question that came in is, what have you noticed is the most powerful educational tool to warn youth against vaping? And I am going to see if you have a response to this one.
I would love to say me going and talking to them. But I know that that's probably not the case. As much as I love my job, I think one of the most powerful things, and not just when it comes to vaping, but really any issue that affects young people, is talking to other young people about it. I think that when young people are able to have these conversations, it can be much more powerful, because me coming in as a 30-something-year-old who went to high school when vaping did not exist yet, it was not on my radar, it was not a thing, because I'll often get asked by students what my experience with vaping is, and I can't relate to them because when I was in middle and high school, it wasn't a thing. So I think that young people being given the space and the place, and also having their capacity built up in a way that they are empowered to be able to have these conversations. Maybe it's presentations, maybe it's just circles, maybe it's a club at their school, any way that young people can talk to other young people about it. As much as I love what I do, I know that not everybody is listening to me, and that's okay. But yeah, and I think just having it in a lot of different spaces, me coming in as sort of the professional, some people are going to listen to that, hearing messages, maybe the same messages I say, but coming from other youth, some people are going to be more likely to listen to that. If it's their parents talking to them, having it come from a lot of different places, I think, because one of the biggest things that we do in Friday Night Live and with our work is changing the norms around these things. Because one of the things that we hear a lot, and I'm sure is kind of the case if you ask someone, how many young people are vaping, or if you went to school and you said what percentage of students at the school are vaping, you would probably hear some pretty high numbers. That the idea is that everybody's doing it, you think that everybody's doing it, and when that is the case, it makes it a lot easier to convince yourself to do it because everybody's doing it. So changing the norms around that can be really powerful. And when we look at the data, we know it's not everyone. The first slide that you showed from the National Youth Tobacco Survey is 14%. Our San Diego County data usually trends slightly lower than national. And more consistent with California, but even that is usually our county data is a little bit lower. So when we look at the data from individual schools or individual districts or even San Diego County as a whole, it's not everyone is doing it. And being able to change that idea, the norms around that, I think can be really powerful as well.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. I agree too. I think a lot of times the peer-to-peer messaging, coming back to that, is really powerful. And I think also the kind of unfortunate thing is a lot of times seeing things firsthand has a bigger effect on youth too. So whether it's they know someone who this has affected and they've seen the changes in their personality or mood or anything like that, right? Or sometimes it's even like their athletic ability. I think sometimes that has a big effect, whether or not, that's peer-to-peer communication or just observation. But I know that's something that um, we hear sometimes too.
Yeah.
All right, so we've got a couple more questions. One that popped up is, what is tobacco retail licensing? And thank you for that question. I did gloss over that a little bit in one of those kind of recommendations, and the things that can really be supportive of the new state law that's going into effect. So tobacco retail licensing is making sure that any retailer that wants to sell a tobacco product, kind of like retailers that sell alcohol, have a license to do so. And what it helps to do is identify those stores, convenience stores, shops, anything like that, or who will be selling. And it makes it easier for training with the businesses, for compliance to make sure that they're upholding national, state, and local laws. So, for example, this law that's going to affect that they're not selling flavored tobacco. Um, and and then it also it allows for that compliance and to keep a better eye on them, just to make sure that they are following the rules. And it really does generally help to reduce youth access to these products too. So hopefully that was a little bit of a 101 on tobacco retail licensing. um, I'll put in a great um, oh, yes, and thank you, Irene. Irene is our great partner from the County of San Diego. A licensing fee to fund compliance monitoring is a really important piece of a tobacco retail license. So when that retailer decides they want to sell tobacco, they they purchase they purchase that license, or they pay a fee into it so that compliance checks can be done. There's additional education training, but it's not just, sending in minors to make sure they're not selling to minors. It's also things like making sure they're adhering to the correct marketing standards, right? You're not supposed to have marketing for tobacco products at eye level for like children. I think there's a certain height. I'm sure Irene is having a nice laugh because I can't remember this off the top of my head. But there's a couple other things that get assessed too. So make sure that the stores are doing things right, and that they are abiding by the laws. And, oh, this is interesting. Do you want to add anything, Alex, to that?
Not to the tobacco retail licensing. That's
Okay.
not as much in my realm.
No
But
worries.
you did a great job of answering that. But
Oh,
I can answer the other question in there.
perfect.
So this one
Do you want me to
says,
read it off?
oh, I can read it. Yeah, you can.
Okay,
Thank you.
good.
I always hear parents getting in long discussions/fights with their kids as kids try so hard to prove that vaping is not dangerous, addiction talking. What would be your best strategy or strategies to get kids to understand that knowledge is power, that they need to find valid information from valid sources to have a smart debate instead of just repeating what they hear or kind of know about these products? One of the things that I think is really important going into conversations with young people, and it has to do with one of my most favorite topics to talk about, and that is the developing brain, is that teenagers' brains work very differently than adult brains. And that's because as adults, anyone over the age of 25, our prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that develops last, that controls our decision making and our risk taking, that part of our brain is fully developed. It's fully functional. But with the developing brain, because the prefrontal cortex isn't fully developed yet, because that more logical, rational part of the brain isn't fully developed yet, you have to go into conversations keeping that in mind, that one of the things it can easily turn into a fight, even if it is more of a discussion, more of a debate, but it can easily turn into a fight because as the parent, as the adult, you're coming in here with the facts, with the logic, A, B, C, D are true, all of this information, But young people, their brain isn't receiving the information in the same way that our fully functioning adult brains receive it. There's a couple other things going on. Um, when teenagers get to be teenagers, a really fun thing happens, and that is our impulse control, which has very recently developed to the point that it is when we hit puberty, kind of goes offline again. It takes a back seat. So during the teenage years, impulse control is taking a back seat while our decision making logic brain is not fully online yet. So there's this big chunk of our development that is ruled almost entirely by emotions. And so keeping that in mind, teenagers are ruled by their emotions and by seeking out things that are going to release dopamine. A lot of times it's, our hobbies, sports, musical instruments, hanging out with our friends, things like that, but can become nicotine very quickly. But going into the conversation with that, where you can present the facts, but the facts are not going to be received in the same way by a teenager as they will be by you, and it's not their fault. They're not doing anything wrong. That just is the way that their brain works. So instead of having it be a presentation of facts where their logical brain is not going to be fully there, understanding that it has to be those conversations here and there, not sit down, let me lecture you on all of the reasons you are wrong, or let me sit down and lecture you about all the reasons your friends are wrong for doing this thing, but just having more of those open conversations, starting out with, the facts, and that's important. That's a very important part of that. That's why it's at the first step of that that guide for how to talk to young people, but bringing up the conversation in a way that they can lead the conversation, that they feel heard. Because if they don't feel heard, they're not going to have conversations with you about it anymore. So I guess having fights about it is better than not talking about it at all. But I think that the short answer would be keeping that very important fact in mind, that their brains are not being ruled by their logic like an adult brain is. Because then it doesn't matter how you're presenting the information. It doesn't matter what tools you have if you're going in with the idea of, I have these facts and you need to learn them. So just having more conversations. What are you seeing? What do you think about it? What do you hear? Do any of your friends do it? Being able to do it in a way that the young person is not going to feel judged, or like if they do start to open up, that like, yeah, my friend, they vape and I've seen these changes, or they vape and it hasn't really affected them, or they vape and it's not that big of a deal. That's their experience. That is a real thing. I can come in and say, vaping's bad. This is what it does to your brain. This is what it does to your lungs. Your lungs can collapse. You can be in the hospital. But if they know 30 people that vape and none of them have experienced any of those things yet, they're not really going to relate to that. They're not going to listen to it. That's not their reality. That's one of the reasons why scare tactics don't work. If we talk about the absolutely worst thing that can happen, it's important to know that it's a risk, but at the same time, that's not the only thing we should be talking about. So having those conversations and remembering that the way that a young person's brain works in these lectures, these conversations, it's very different than our adult brains. I think that's it.
Thank you, Alex. Yes, I think that was all for our Q&A, and appreciate all those questions that came in. And I almost can't believe it is 6:30. We weren't sure we were going to go for a full hour, but you guys kept those questions coming in. So I am going to wrap it up here and just say a special thank you to Alex for joining us this evening for this conversation, and appreciate your time. And as we're heading into the holiday season and a larger break might be around, maybe around your kids more, think about being open to having these conversations, and we're rooting for you and wishing you all the best, and being open-minded and having these convos with your kids. So thank you again, and everyone joining us, and have a wonderful evening. And we will be sending out the slides and the presentation recording so you can revisit it or share. So thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Happy
you.
holidays.